Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back to Track 3, the Drug Development Pathway, sponsored by PRA Health Sciences. Thanks to Shire for sponsoring this afternoon's lunch. I'm Cassandra, and I am your Track 3 room host. As a reminder, I would like to welcome those joining us remotely through the live stream, and remember to download the app, which we will be utilizing at the end of this presentation for the Q&A. We are joined this afternoon by Bruce Bloom, President and Chief Science Officer for Cures Within Reach, and Yael Wise, Vice President of Business Development at Genex Pharmaceutical. They're going to walk us through today the drug repositioning pipeline, finding new indications for approved and shelved therapeutics. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Cassandra. So I'm going to go first, and Yael will go second. If you guys can put the slides up, that would be great. Apparently, I'm not supposed to stand that close to the podium. 3 sections in this hour's presentation. I'm going to take the first 20 minutes to walk through what we call drug repurposing, taking drugs, devices, nutraceuticals already available for human use, FDA approved, and finding new uses. Then I'm going to turn the presentation time over to Yael, who's going to talk about drug repositioning, taking drug-like compounds that have been partway through pharmaceutical development but haven't yet been approved for any indication, and finding new uses for those. And then the last 20 minutes we'll reserve for questions. Now, I want to make clear, we've both been doing this for a while, and as we do these presentations, if there's anything we haven't made clear because maybe we passed over a step that may seem obvious to us because we've been doing it that long, please ask a question. There aren't any questions that aren't appropriate. Our job here is to help you understand this if you don't already understand it. So can you put the first slide up there? Or do I? I see. I have the way of doing this. Let's see. There we go. All right, so this is what I'm going to talk about today. The differences between commercial and philanthropic drug repurposing and drug repositioning. Then I'm going to talk about how we do repositioning or repurposing in this area. And then I'm going to talk about our organization, its successes, and other organizations that are working on this that you might want to know about. So let's start with, as a baseline, what normal new drug discovery looks like. And this is a schematic of all of the steps that are involved in doing this. And maybe the most important thing to remember from a rare disease perspective is, in order to get a drug out the back end, you have to start with some compound that you think might work, that you have good scientific evidence that it might work. So there's been other talks here, and we'll continue around how you discover these things, but this is about lead generation. How do you find one or more lead molecules or lead devices or lead nutraceuticals that could make it to the end and have some impact on the disease that you're interested in? Now, doing lead discovery is really complicated. So here's a sort of a schematic on all the ways we find lead molecules to do new drug discovery. As you can see, there's probably 30 or 40 ways on here, and this isn't all of them. This was an article that was published 3 years ago, so my guess is since then we've probably figured out 8 or 10 new ways of discovering leads for molecules that you might use. So it's a very complicated area, and because of that, we don't always get it right. So if you look at the history of drug development, what you find out is for every molecule that gets to the beginning of lead discovery, less than 1 in 10,000 of them gets all the way to the market at the end. And because of that, all the time you spend whittling those 10,000s down to 100 and push one across the finish line, that's where we get the high costs of a lot of the drugs. I mean, part of the high cost is that there's nothing else to do, and the drug maker can set the cost at whatever the drug maker wants. But the reality is, all of those failures get bundled into the cost of the one success, and to pay all back for all those failures, we end up with very high costs of drugs. Because the development might have cost over $1 billion with all those together. And it's taken, as you can see up here, sometimes as much as 12 to 15 or 17 years between the time you discover the lead and the time it gets to market. So it's a slow, expensive, uncertain process, and yet it's primarily what we use to deliver therapeutics in the rare disease area. So what I want to talk about is commercial drug repurposing. And as you can see, we've cut off the, on your side, the left end of the basic science and lead generation, and we've started with things we already know might work because we know the genetic basis of the disease, or because some patients have already been taking it or taking something like it. And because we're starting at preclinical development, we can cut off a lot of the time. Also, because when we do commercial repurposing, we're starting with a molecule or a device that already is approved and we know is safe for human use and has been taken and gone through a regulatory process, we can cut off a lot of the other costs, the toxicity costs, the animal trials, and all sorts of things, and often can move fairly quickly into clinical development. Now, once we get into that pathway, we still have to do the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. Now, because it's a rare disease, often those trials are much smaller than they would be in common diseases. For example, a phase 3 trial in a common disease might have anywhere from 2,500 to 10,000 patients in it. A phase 3 trial for a rare disease might have a couple of hundred patients in it. And so that helps reduce the cost and the time it takes. You know, imagine if you had to accrue 10,000 patients, it'd probably take you 3 or 4 years. If you only have to accrue a couple hundred rare disease patients, not that that's easy, we know it's not, but it takes a lot less time. So because of all of that, as you can see, you can have a higher success rate because we've already started with things that we know work in the human body, we know how they interact with other drugs, and you can have much lower costs. So as you can see here, the timeline's maybe 4 to 7 years. The cost is less than $100 million, and when the treatments get to patients, you don't have as much cost to recoup, and so those therapies can be at a much lower cost and still give the pharmaceutical company or whoever brought it to market the opportunity to make a good profit. Now, I also want to look at what we call philanthropic development. At Cures Within Reach, about 80% of what we do is philanthropic development. And if you look, what we've done is cut off something on the right end of the development process, the market approval. In philanthropic drug repurposing, all we're trying to do is fund and complete a proof of concept clinical trial that is robust enough that when the results are published in a journal, clinicians that treat those patients can read the data, can read the study and say, this is strong enough that I'm going to talk to my patient about whether we should use this or not. And in the world of rare diseases where there's no other therapeutic, often a repurposed therapy like this is very helpful in the patient population. And I'll talk about a couple of specific success stories about that in a few minutes. But you can see the costs are much lower, less than $10 million, and often even less than $5 million to do the pivotal clinical trial. And the timelines are even shorter, 3 to 5 years. So if we start from this standpoint and we're only trying to prove enough that physicians will use it off-label, we can shorten the timeline and reduce the cost. And the end result is often a very low-cost therapy because this drug or nutraceutical or device or combination already out in the marketplace, often generic, so very inexpensive. And again, I'll talk about some successes we have with that. The success rate goes up, again, because these drugs have been used often by millions of people, and we know how to manage them, we know how to get them, they're widely available, so the success rate goes even higher. So as you think of yourself as an advocate in rare diseases or as a patient or as a foundation, you can see that there are various levels where you can put some or all of the funds that you raised to try and drive therapies to patients. Now, I want to look at one additional thing. So this kind of philanthropic drug development pretty inexpensive, pretty quick, very low cost outcome, high success rate. But we can even do even better than that, because often the starting point of philanthropic repurposing is successes in small places out in clinical practice, or incredibly strong scientific data that have suddenly become available to us. So an example of this would be, there might be a clinical practice someplace in the US that has discovered that using some combination of generic drugs helps a clinical outcome for a group of rare disease patients. We find out about it. We raise the funds to do a confirmatory clinical trial, knowing that there's a strong likelihood of success because there's already been success in clinical practice. And then we can shorten the timeline. In addition, the costs go down even further, the success rates go up, and sometimes we can deliver these within 18 to 36 months to patient populations, knowing that we've had a great starting place. So if you look at sort of the three kinds of things that we're involved in: commercial drug repurposing, philanthropic drug repurposing starting at the preclinical stage, and philanthropic drug repurposing starting at the clinical development stage, all of those are really good things for you to keep in mind as you're trying to decide how to fund research that can help the patients you care about the most. So on this slide, I just wanted to show you, this is a complicated slide, but there's one thing that I want to point out. So you wonder, well, how likely is this to happen for my rare disease? Well, if you look up at the top here, this was a study that was recently completed about repurposing, and what you can see is where the green arrow is, or the blue arrow is up there, there are 2,000 compounds that have already been launched and approved. Launched meaning they were out in the marketplace. 2,000 drugs. There's another 1,000 nutraceuticals. Nutraceuticals are things that you buy at the local health food store. And they have many drug-like products. And in fact, some of them are very active, but they've just never been approved as a drug. The molecule in green tea, ECGC, is a very bioactive molecule in the human body. It does many things, and we've repurposed it in conjunction with other things to solve a couple of rare disease problems. So there's a lot of opportunity out here. When you think of 7,000 disease and 3,000 already human-approved compounds, alone or in combination, there's a huge amount of opportunity, and there are many researchers and clinicians that have these ideas just looking for the opportunity to bring them to a rare disease patient group. There's lots of successes out there in repurposing. This is just a list of a few of them. What you'll notice in the column all the way to your right is not many of these diseases are rare. And the reason that that's true is for a lot of drug repurposing, there isn't a great commercial outcome. And so pharmaceutical companies and others that have to make a big profit aren't interested. They can't be interested in the kind of drug repurposing that we can be interested in, because we're not there to help make a profit. We're only there to drive these therapies out to the patients. So I want to talk a little bit about our organization. We've been doing repurposing since 1999, when we funded the first clinical trial repurposing the drug thalidomide for the rare blood cancer multiple myeloma. In the end, we and others who funded that research were able to help prove that thalidomide significantly improved the outcome for those patients. And in 2005, thalidomide went and got market approval for a new indication for multiple myeloma. In the last 12 years, hundreds of thousands of myeloma patients have taken thalidomide. Celgene, the company that made that drug, has now made lenalidomide and pomalidomide and many other derivatives of thalidomide that are helping other rare blood cancers. And so this is a huge success with a drug that was taken off the market because of the birth defects that it caused when pregnant mothers took the drug originally. It was originally brought out as a sort of a morning sickness pill to relieve nausea, and it caused limbs to not grow properly. But it has certain characteristics that made it appropriate to repurpose out in the marketplace. Over the last 5 years, our funders have funded 60 preclinical and clinical trials that have yielded 14 repurposing successes that are being used right now. And if you look at all of the research, the preclinical and clinical, it's a 22% success rate. If you only look at the clinical trials, it's a 40% success rate. That's pretty amazing in the world of drug development. So here's a list of the things that we have been involved in that are funders, and you can see in red, it's a little hard to see, but the red ones are all rare diseases. The ones in black are more common diseases. So 9 of the 14 repurposing successes we've had are in rare diseases, and that's not by accident. Because rare diseases don't have a lot of support from the pharmaceutical industry or others, and because there's so many of them, and because the clinicians and the patient advocates that are involved in this are so determined to find things, we get more opportunities in the rare disease world than we get in the common disease world. And so when we find a funder and a researcher to match up, we're often able to create a great success. And you can see we've done this with drugs, with nutraceuticals, with devices. We even have one right now that's a combination of a generic drug and an old device together that are helping a rare disease, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we do this through our network. We've got over 50 research institutions around the world that partner with us. We do all this through our Cure Accelerator platform, which is sort of like an Amazon.com for repurposing research. So funders, clinicians, researchers, patients, patient advocates, industry, government, all can come together to propose ideas, which is like being a seller, and to propose proposals, which is like, propose requests for ideas, which is like being a buyer, and propose research, which is like being a seller, and we hook them up together. We currently have 25 clinical trials going, 10 of which are in rare diseases, and 5 commercial repurposing, 2 of which are in rare diseases. So these are our commercialization opportunities, and the good thing about commercialization is it ensures that it moves along, and more physicians will use it in the end if it has a market approval. But we still focus primarily, our job is to focus primarily on philanthropic work, because otherwise it just doesn't get done. Now, there's a couple of other groups that we work with. One of them is here, Mission Cure, using pay-for-success economic models to try and move repurposing along in rare diseases. And Cures Within Reach for Cancer, which is funding larger phase 3 clinical trials where repurposing of generic drugs is important. And then there's a couple of global organizations we work with, Find a Cure and Helix in the United Kingdom, and Anti-Cancer Fund out in Europe, all of them working on repurposing for rare diseases. So that's my presentation. We're going to transition now to Yale, who's going to talk about how you take compounds that have been partially through pharmaceutical pipeline, safe for human use, and can be further moved along to help rare diseases. So I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Bruce.
There you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yael from Genex, and for those of you who don't know Genex, I just did something wrong, I guess. What am I supposed to press, Bruce?
I think they're putting your slides up, so give it a second.
Okay, so I didn't do something wrong yet. Ultragenyx is a company based in Novato in Northern California in the Bay Area. Was started 7 years ago by Emil Kakis and is now a company of, no, not yet.
There you go.
Yes, I did have slides. I have them in my, Maureen? I have them in my bag if we can hook them up. I'll just go without slides. Now everybody's going to know the password on my computer. Big G, little g, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, let me start differently because maybe they will be able to get the slides up. First of all, I want you to know that at Ultragenyx, since we are dedicated to rare genetic diseases, and in many cases we get parents and patients coming to us and asking for help in diseases that we aren't necessarily working on. We decided together with Odentis and Takeda and a few other companies to put together a workshop for patients or relatives who are interested in starting a company or understanding more about how to start a company, how to repurpose, how to develop a drug. And it will take place in November at our offices in Ultragenyx. We have an online site where people can apply, and we'll be happy to receive applications. I hope that some of you are sitting here that are interested in learning more and hopefully interested in participating. So if there is someone who is interested, please feel free to come to me or to Megan at the end of the talk. And? We're getting there? Okay. So going back to Ultragenyx, we are a company that were founded based on the notion that there are many people that are working in rare diseases in academia and biotech companies, and they understand the science very well, but they don't understand or don't have the capabilities or don't have the funding to take their inventions and turn them into drugs. So when Emil started Ultragenyx, he decided to focus most of the efforts and most of the resources on building a very strong clinical development team and regulatory, and now we're building commercial, and taking inventions that others have made or other discoveries and translating them into drugs. So now, 7 years later, we're researching 12 different rare diseases. We have 5 diseases that are being currently treated in the clinic, and we're constantly looking for innovation and to bring in novel therapies for rare genetic diseases. We're currently 450 people, constantly growing, and hoping to launch our first drug very soon. So this was where I was supposed to start my real presentation and talk about repurposing. And to address or to follow up on what Bruce was talking about, for me, repurposing is not only taking a drug that was already approved, obviously it has a lot of benefits, as you heard from Bruce, but also taking something that was originally discovered or a different company actually started working on it for one indication, and for some reason, whatever it is, stopped the development. It could be very early on in preclinical development, and there's some safety data already. It could be later on in clinical development, and there's clinical safety, but the drug hasn't been approved. And our job as a rare disease company is to look at these compounds and to understand if there's potential to take them away from what they were originally developed for and repurpose them or reposition them into a rare disease indication. And this is what I call the many flavors of drug repurposing. One flavor is, as Bruce was talking about, taking something that's already been approved. Another flavor is going to different big pharma companies, and I'll talk a little bit about our collaboration with Takeda, and asking them, do you have something on your shelves that you started developing and discontinued because it was no longer commercially viable for you, or because it wasn't competitive, or because you found that it wasn't working for the indication that you were developing it for, and can we take it and see if it can work in a rare disease indication? So that's another flavor. And the third flavor is working with companies like Takeda and other companies and looking at things that are very early, in which the pathways are understood. And here we go. Okay, thank you. No, that's Bruce's slides. Let's see if I can run through them quickly. Okay. No, nope, nothing's happening. So that's not from my computer then. Anyway, I'll have to continue improvising. And the third way would be to actually work with companies like Takeda that have a lot of knowledge on discovering small molecules and drugs very early on, but they decided to set things aside or decided that the markets are too small and take these compounds very early on and bring them into a company like Ultragenyx. So I have a few examples, and actually, for those, I do need the slides a bit, but I'll try to describe them without the slides. So one program that we're currently working on is triheptanoin, which is an oil-based therapy that was originally used by patients that did not have any clinical data on this product. And we decided to take this same formulation that the patients were using without having any clinical data and actually take it into clinical trials and show that it works. So the initial indication that patients were taking it for was FAOD, a fatty acid oxidation disorder, which is a disorder in which patients cannot metabolize fatty acids and are thus lacking energy, and they suffer from various symptoms that are associated with the lack of energy, such as fainting or muscle weakness and similar symptoms. So we decided to take this therapy and put it into the clinic, and we're currently developing it for FAOD. So that's one part of the repurposing for this drug. And the second part of it is actually when we started developing it and getting good results in a phase 2 clinical study, investigators from all over the world started coming to us and saying, oh, if it works for this, maybe it will work for that, and maybe it will work for another indication. So we started looking at different indications, and it made sense because if this is a drug that can actually provide energy to patients that are lacking energy, perhaps it will work in other conditions where there's not enough energy getting to the brain, for example. So investigators that are working on seizure disorders came to us and suggested that we test it in a disorder called GLUT1 deficiency, which is a disease in which there is a mutation in the receptor that actually brings glucose into the brain. And what happens to these patients? Again, their brain doesn't get enough energy, and they're constantly feeling tired and have seizures, and they have movement disorders. So we decided to take this indication on and use the same drug. So it's not exactly repurposing or repositioning, but it's giving this drug another chance in an additional indication, and we're now putting this into the clinic. It's in the clinic as well for GLUT1 deficiency movement disorders. Another example that I had, and here are my slides. Oh, wow. Talking and talking, and here they are. And nothing's happening. So the Ultragenyx, I'll go back to that in the end if you want to hear more about Ultragenyx. These are the flavors, different flavors of repositioning. Personally, thanks, Bruce. I'm a dark chocolate person, but everybody can choose their own flavor here, and this is why repositioning can be so interesting, because there are so many different flavors, and everyone wants to choose or can choose the flavor they like. Let me jump ahead. So I'll jump to the examples, and then I'll come back to these because it's sort of out of sequence now. So the second example that I wanted to talk about is our product called Berusumab. It's a monoclonal antibody against FGF23. And we have a partner for this program. It's a Japanese company called KHK, and they originally developed this product for chronic kidney disease. But as they started developing this antibody, they realized that developing it for chronic kidney disease is going to be very challenging. The clinical trials are going to be very complicated and very long. And when they were going through the literature, they found this rare genetic disease called XLH, X-linked hypophosphatemia, which has the hallmarks of the disease is an excess in FGF23, which is similar to what is seen in chronic kidney disease. So KHK seeked a rare genetic disease partner to develop this product, and we're actually now together developing it. It's been filed recently. We have some very promising data in children and in adults with X-linked hypophosphatemia, and an antibody that could have originally just died on the shelf in KHK is now becoming a therapy for X-linked hypophosphatemia patients. This is FAOD, which I told you about already. So I'm just going to jump through these and go back to them if you want to hear about one specific indication or another. And this slide describes a collaboration that we put in place about 2 years ago with a pharmaceutical company, another Japanese company called Takeda. And it's a good example for how a big pharma company that is very general and wants to treat big indications can partner with a small rare disease company like ours. And it's a synergistic relationship in which they have obviously access to big compound libraries and a lot of chemistry know-how and many compounds that they could actually lend or pass over to us for development in rare genetic diseases. And we have the expertise to identify which compounds we actually want to develop and very quickly in animal models see if our theory about these compounds is actually correct and it will work in these rare genetic diseases, and take them into the clinic, obviously, and get them approved. So we're working with an organization within Takeda called the Techcelerator. It's a newly formed organization. Obviously, Bruce has an accelerator, and Takeda has their own Techcelerator. It's a small group that has access to all of Takeda's capabilities and compounds, and they are looking to find ways to partner these compounds with external organizations, whether it's a company like ours or with academics or with patient groups, in order to leverage and maximize the value of these compounds that otherwise would not be developed. As you can see, this is the focus, this is the official Takeda slide on what the Techcelerator is focusing on. And you can see that the first bullet is to establish the capability to execute rare disease projects. And the last bullet is specifically to reposition from Takeda Pipline and find new indications for their compounds. So they're a very good partner for us. And we hopefully will have a few interesting stories to tell on how we repositioned drugs that they originally developed for very big indications like CNS indications and cardiovascular indications, and we're taking them into rare genetic diseases. So just a high-level overview of how Takeda approach repurposing on their side and how we help them actually make the decisions on which assets to reposition. And I think starting on the right-hand side where it says disease-centric, this is where we come from. We know the diseases. We have the expertise. We can tell very quickly if there's the right animal model to put these compounds into, if there's a way to prove that the compounds work, if there is a way to actually develop these compounds, if there is proof of concept in animals, are there any endpoints in patients that we can actually take the drugs into? Is there a way to show that the drugs actually work? So we bring this knowledge into the table when we discuss the repositioning. And then what Takeda do, they do what they know how to do. They're very drug-centric or target-centric. They start from the very beginning, looking at the receptor in the cell or the little protein in the cell that has to be affected, and they find the compounds without always knowing what the bigger picture is and how these compounds can affect not only the diseases that they're thinking about, but also diseases that are within our scope. There are a lot of use of bioinformatics, data mining, of course, looking at genetics very deeply, looking into pedigrees. And when it all comes together, we sit together around one table and decide on which disease we want to treat with which compound. This is just to give you an idea of how we technically do it. We have a big list of candidates that can potentially become a therapy for a rare genetic disease. And we work with Takeda. We put together a work plan. And let's say it's a cellular assay or an animal model that we think would actually give us the answer of whether this drug is working or not. And once they have proven the concept, and we think there's a way forward, we would take it into Ultragenyx and continue developing it. And we have an arrangement where obviously everybody's happy at the end from a financial perspective. So how do I go back? Let me go back just to a few slides in the beginning that I missed when. And then I'll have to go back to the end afterwards. So I wanted to start with this, but I think it's also, will work to end with this, is unlike Bruce's organization, which have a very clear focus on, and they know that they're looking for drugs that have already been approved because they don't have the resources or the patience to actually start from the beginning or even from the middle where we're coming in. So what we're looking for is usually a compound that has some, in the past, whatever it was developed for, that it has some preclinical knowledge about the preclinical activity. It does work somewhere on something. It engages with a target. And then if there is some clinical data, even better, but it's not mandatory. It doesn't have to be approved for another indication, but definitely the more information that we have, the better. We'd like it to have some form of intellectual property. As Bruce alluded to, we do spend a lot of money developing our medicines, and we'd like to be able to protect ourselves and have at least some advantage when we get to the market. So it doesn't have to be the composition, exactly the chemical structure, but it can be a method, so taking this compound and testing it in this disease, that's fine. Or it can be related to manufacturing, it's also fine. But we just need some protection that will give us an advantage in the market. We like to know the mechanism of action, which is usually pretty easy in monogenic genetic diseases, because we know what's mutated and we know what we need to bring back into the cell in order to make it work properly. And we'd like to know that there is a well-defined development path. So it can be a biomarker that will tell us that the drug is working. It can be a clinical endpoint that is very clear and very obvious. But we like to know that we have this before we start embarking into a program, and after showing it works in animals, realizing we can't show that it works in people. And of course, we'd like to at least return our investment and hopefully make some money so that we can develop more drugs that might fail, and then Bruce can take them and repurpose them. So now I'm going to run back forward. I think that was my last slide. So in summary, we're a biotech that is focused on rare genetic diseases. This is all we do, and this is what we do all day, every day. And we want to source as many molecules and compounds from wherever we can. And it can be a nutraceutical. It can be a drug that failed for another indication. It can be a drug that was approved for another indication. That's fine. So we're very flexible on what the starting point is. We are happy to collaborate with other companies, and we like to expand the use of existing products, as I told you about FAOD, to other indications if possible. So not adhere just to one clinical indication, but to try to find as many uses for our compounds as possible. And I think that's it. Sorry about the technical glitches. Thanks, Bruce.
So Cassandra's going to come up and guide the question and answer session. So we'll turn the mic over to her.
Thank you both very much. So now we can go ahead and either feed your questions via the app or come up to one of the two mics and go ahead and ask your questions. We'll start with you in the room.
Great. Jody Gillen with Achillion Pharmaceuticals. Thank you for this presentation. It was really informative. I have a question I think is more for Bruce. When I think of philanthropic development, I think of compassionate use. And I'm curious how that comes into play with your model, if you hear of successes and then move forward with that. And then also how you might partner with pharmaceutical companies. Do any contact you directly?
Great. So from a compassionate use standpoint, sometimes compassionate use of already approved drugs for a new indication is a starting point for us. And there are actually a couple of pharmaceutical companies, small pharmaceutical companies that we work with that are able to help out on some compassionate use opportunities. For those of you that don't know, and I'm not an expert in this area, but there are a couple of ways that compassionate use can be moved forward. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're developing a drug for a disease that doesn't have any therapeutics right now, and you're not finished with your clinical trials, somebody that doesn't qualify for your clinical trial can get access to your compound as long as they have a physician who writes a letter to the FDA, and the company is also willing to provide the drug. And so this turns out to be like a little one-patient clinical trial. That wouldn't involve us very often, but sometimes in the development of drugs, whether they're approved or not, you'll find a new indication, and the company that is making the drug wants to provide that drug without going through all of the large clinical trial development. And in those situations, that can lead to an opportunity for us to then find philanthropic funds to fund a clinical trial to see whether that works or not. Your second question was about how we work with pharmaceutical companies. So in a number of different ways. Sometimes what we find is we'll find a researcher at an academic lab who has an idea for a proprietary drug, a drug that's in the marketplace still under patent protection. And we'll evaluate whether this looks like a good opportunity, and if it does, we'll approach the pharmaceutical company to see what interest they have in it, whether they want to be the ones that connect directly with that researcher and figure out how to create some kind of an arrangement, whether they want to license the method of use for that, whether the intellectual property's already been secured, whether they want us to be involved and funnel some drugs through us to get to the research institution so we can do a proof of concept trial to see if it still works. So that's one way we work with pharmaceutical companies. A second way, which is a little bit like what Yael and Ultragenyx does, is sometimes pharmaceutical partners will come to us with a drug and ask us to search our network for other ideas to work with it. And so instead of waiting to find out what somebody already knows, they'll put enough information out there, and then our scientists that are interested in working on certain diseases will see, oh, well, that hits a target that's relevant to the rare disease I'm working on, and they'll then develop an idea around this. So we work with pharmaceutical companies like that. And then the third way is pharmaceutical companies just like the work that we do because it's around the edges of things they're not going to get to. And so they just fund us, sponsor our organization, find ways to sit on our boards or other things. So we're always eager to find new pharmaceutical groups. Yael, anything that you guys do around compassionate use?
Well, for most of our diseases are pretty rare, and we do enable access to patients before the drugs are approved. Compassionate use for additional indications? Yes, but not. It doesn't happen on a regular basis. But can I ask Bruce a question?
You can.
Uh-oh.
So Bruce, how do you ensure that patients have access to the drugs that you develop, or you've proved that they work in a certain disease? How do patients get access to it? Because it's not approved by regulators, it's off-label, as I saw in your slides. How do patients know about it? How do patients get to these drugs? And how do they get reimbursed for these drugs?
That's a critical question. So the first thing, how do they know about it? Well, the good news, at least in the rare disease world, is that every disease we've ever worked with in the rare disease world that has enough organization to create funding has enough organization to spread the word. And so it spreads like wildfire between the patient advocates and the families and the physicians around the world and the researchers that are so tied into these tight networks. When we repurposed the drug sirolimus for a rare pediatric autoimmune disease, this was in the final results came out in 2006. Within 3 months of the publication of the results, the principal investigator had received over 300 emails and phone calls from physicians around the world who read the article or heard about it from a patient family and called to say, okay, I need help figuring out how to dose this patient or how to manage these additional risks. So there's an underground network, and it's become even easier because now electronic filing of all of the publications. So 10 years ago, when we did this sirolimus thing, you had to go and read the actual paper. So if you skipped that month of the journal, you didn't see it. Now you put in your keywords and it pushes it to your desktop. You can't miss anything if you're a practitioner and you have any kind of electronics. So that's one thing. Second thing around payers. So what we have found is that often the first time a patient goes to their payer and says, I want this off-label drug for this disease, it gets rejected. And the good news for us is that most of the therapies we repurpose are relatively inexpensive, and when they reduce the signs and symptoms of the disease, bring healthcare costs way down. And so what the patients end up doing is paying for the first 3 or 4 months. Then the care payer sees the cost of this patient has gone way down. The patient and the physician reapply for coverage and talk to somebody who's actually crunching the numbers that says it's better to have the patient stay on this drug than get off of it. And so it tends to take a little while. And once some of the payers have started paying for it, it starts to slide into more of the standard of care.
Great.
You make it sound easy.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it happens.
Yeah.
We've got a question that came in. So how can patients get insurance approval for more expensive drugs such as biologics that went through the philanthropic repurposing and are off-label?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll have to say, so far we haven't repurposed any biologics, and I think that's going to be a really challenging issue. So they're very expensive, and my guess is that for our organization, where we're at right now, it's going to be difficult for us to raise the significant amount of money it's going to take to conduct an off-label biologics clinical trial, because the cost of the drug will be 5 times what the average cost of our total clinical trial is. So I hope one day we'll be able to do that, maybe when some of the biosimilars bring the price down, although I don't think it's going to come down by 90%. I think it's going to come down by 20%. But that's going to be a real challenge. I expect that if we were able to do those trials and the biologics worked as well as we thought they would, there'd be no reason why an organization like Genex wouldn't take that to market, because there'll be plenty of ways to make your initial investment back. And it's probably going to take a lot more regulation than we put into our proof of concept clinical trials. Because when you do your work, I'm going to assume you do them at regulatory approval standards. When we do our work, we're trying to do it robust enough that a physician who reads this, that he or she will be able to see that the data are sound and robust, but they probably aren't good enough to go through some FDA regulatory process.
So that limits the repertoire of drugs that you can repurpose.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you both for the great information. At this time, if you'd like to go on to the mobile app to take our brief survey before we head out for another afternoon break sponsored by Sanofi. Our next breakout session will begin in 15 minutes, and please join me in thanking our speakers again for their time.
Thank you.
And by the way, I'm around the rest of the weekend till Sunday, so if you want to come and talk to me or find me through the partnering app, I'm happy to be a resource for anybody.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, nice job.
Thank you.
Sorry.